I would start by, making sure you know what your outflow is. So, like, start with, like, what is it that you are paying for every month? And it starts with just kind of keeping an eye on what those are. And one thing that you can do is say, okay, how about we start with the fixed expenses will come out of this person's salary, and the variable expenses will come out of this person's salary.
Welcome to the Teacher Money Show, the podcast dedicated to helping teachers navigate your unique financial challenges and unlock your financial superpowers. I'm your host, Sean Morgan, a full-time educator and personal financial coach and speaker. And I'm here to help every teacher, whether you're a seasoned teacher looking for fresh insights or a new educator navigating your first paycheck, have a richer wallet, classroom, and life. I am super excited to have Emily Guy Birken on the show today. Emily is a former educator, lifelong money nerd, and an Plutus Award-winning freelance writer. I even have one of her fantastic books, Stacked, which she co-wrote with Joe Saul-Sehy. For anyone who's listened to the Stacking Benjamin show, that's Joe, and it's a fantastic book. And we're just going to talk about money, getting out of debt, saving our money today, which is all well within Emily's wheelhouse as a former educator, financial writer, and overall money nerd. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, as someone who is a former educator and a money nerd, I always just like to ask, how did you get into teaching even though you no longer do it? And
Mhm.
how did you get into personal finance?
So, how I got into teaching is actually through AmeriCorps. I was an AmeriCorps volunteer. Oh gosh, this is dating me in 2003. And the program that I was working in had me at a Boys and Girls Club where I was an art program. I was doing uh, AmeriCorps volunteering with kids in an art program at a Boys and Girls Club, and I loved it. And I'd been kind of a bit of a career butterfly. I'd worked off and on at a bookstore. I had, just done all kinds of different jobs, nothing that really stuck. And I decided that I loved working with kids. And so I decided I wanted to teach. And I was living in Columbus, Ohio at the time. And so I got my Master's of English Education at OSU. And I started teaching at the Southwestern City Schools in the Columbus area. And I taught high school English for 4 years in that area. And because we are really bad at timing is how I ended up not teaching anymore. Um, my husband took a job in another state after my fourth year of teaching when we were expecting my first child. My son was due at the beginning of the next school year, and so I knew I wasn't going to have a teaching job that school year. And so just to keep a little bit of money coming in, I wanted to find some writing gigs. I was thinking I'd write about things like parenting or education, travel, those typical things. But one of the first gigs that I landed was for a financial website. No, it's not entirely out of left field that I was writing about money because my dad was a financial planner. I've always been a money nerd, but I've never thought of myself that way prior to that. My bachelor's degree was in English literature and French literature. My master's degree was in English education. I was very literary. So the idea of being like a financial person didn't really cross my mind. But I saw the opportunity to write about money. I was like, oh, I could do that. The first article I wrote for that site went mini viral. I think dozens of people saw it, but my editor loved that it took off, and so passed my name along to his friends. I was invited to FinCon, the very first one, which was in 2011, which is a financial media um, conference, and from there was got more clients and things kind of took off. So my original plan was I'd stay home with the baby for 1 year. The baby is now 15, so it kind of it worked out really well in part because um, I'm originally from the East Coast. I met my husband in Columbus, Ohio. We had our babies in Lafayette, Indiana, and we're now in Milwaukee. And in none of those places did we have kind of an extended network. So being able to have a career where I was the primary parent to work from home meant it was a lot easier than it would have been if I'd been in the classroom. I honestly am not sure how I would have handled, um, things like early babyhood with both my kids, with the number of like child visits and, when they get sick and can't go to daycare and those sorts of things. There are a lot of things I miss about the classroom, but what I learned as a teacher, I very much apply to my life as a financial writer.
Yeah, I love that you still have that heart for education going on there, because that's what we're all about. We want educators to stay in education and feel financially
Mhm.
empowered as they do that. That's one of the big goals of my podcast is to not have people leave. And you didn't leave because you're like, oh, I hate this, I'm getting out of here. You just circumstance got you there. But I love this connection here. You were in education because you love helping kids, and now you're doing other things to help people, which is really
Mhm.
what it is. Like financial literacy helps people, and when you're doing this, you get to this point where you're teaching people about money, you're talking about money. Is that when you were starting to be like, wait a minute, my finances need to change, or was it before that point that you had that revelation?
It was before that. So when my husband and I got married in 2008. He had purchased the house that was our first house together in 2005. You're probably young enough, you might not remember, but in 2005, they were like handing mortgages to anyone with a pulse. When he bought the house, he put down a very, very minimal down payment, and then he had a home equity line of credit for the rest of the down payment. And again, this is because I was raised by a financial planner and because the way that I look at money, that made me very uncomfortable. And we were together, but just boyfriend, girlfriend when he bought the house. So, I didn't have like it was his financial decision to do that. So when we got married in 2008, um, and I had been teaching for 2 years at that point, I said, I really don't like that, we have this HELOC that, you're paying this interest on that was the down payments. And so like you don't have you're not building equity in the house and all of that. It's making me uncomfortable. What if we live on your income because my husband's a mechanical engineer. And so as a mechanical engineer, he was earning more than me as a teacher. So what if we live on your income and we send mine to pay that off, to try to do that as quickly as possible. And he was like open to the idea. He wasn't sure. Like he was like, "Are you sure that that's going to work?" I was like, "Yeah, I think we can do it." And we ended up making like a debt payoff thermometer on like a whiteboard that we put in our kitchen. And this is again long enough ago that we were getting like the statements in the mail, but and like we would like race each other home on the day, like because I think we got the statement around the 15th of the month. And so like on the 15th, we'd want to be the one to get home first because we'd get to color in how much further we paid off. Um, and because we had said at the quarter, half, and three-quarter mark, and then payoff mark, we had like little incentives for ourselves. And there were little things like there was an Indian restaurant that we really liked. So like we're gonna go out, we're gonna get there, and they had like a buffet. So we're gonna go out, we're gonna get there the Indian food buffet for when we get the halfway mark. And because, $30 worth of the buffet to celebrate having paid off something like $16,000 in debt. Felt like an appropriate way to celebrate that sort of thing. So that's who I've always been, even before I started writing about money, which is why writing about money ended up being such a good fit for me.
So most people don't think to themselves just out of the blue, hey, let's not spend any of my salary. Like there's The Richest Man in Babylon, classic, financial advice book, recommends 20%, and that's like, wow, 20% towards debt is a big number, and you're saying 50%. Well, maybe I don't know what the actual amount is, but like half of what you would expect usually is like half of I'm working, you're working. I'm going to take my whole salary and put it whatever the percentage was, doesn't matter. It's still a huge chunk out of what
Hmm.
you guys could be living on. Where did this idea generate from for you? Like, is this something that you would have learned from your dad, or did you see it somewhere else, or how did you come up with this idea to live on just his income so that way you guys could use yours for paying down debt?
Uh, you know, it's long enough ago that I'm not entirely sure where the idea came from. I don't really remember. I do know that some of it has to do with the way that I look at money. And I tend to look at money kind of the way you play Tetris, in that, like, from the time I was tiny, I would be like, okay, how can I slot things in? How can I make it fit? And so when, my spouse and I were merging finances, and and I have always been someone who pays very close attention to my money. So, I balance my checkbook for fun, that sort of thing. Who I always have been. So I had a good sense of like how much we spend on dining out, how much we spend on groceries, how much like our insurance costs are, like what we need to set aside for like property taxes. I had a sense of all of those things. So some of it was like we can cover all this with just one salary. So some of it is just the like, hey, I know that we've got all this covered with one salary and without affecting our standard of living in any way. So why don't we be intentional? Let's be intentional with our money, rather than let it just, because it's so easy to, spend $45 here and $100 there without even really thinking about it, and having nothing really to show for it. And so that's really kind of where it came from, is this urge to be intentional, and wanting to have something to show for those first 2 years of our marriage. And we actually had someone at some point say to us, like, "That's silly. Why are you doing that? That's a ridiculous thing to do." Um, because like there and and this was someone who worked in finance. Um, and what uh I think what that person was trying to say was it wasn't hurting us in any way to carry that HELOC. Like that it wasn't, while we were paying interest on it, it wasn't, debilitating interest, and all of those things. Um, and that we could have been, putting that money into retirement accounts, or I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what their thinking was. Um, but this was very empowering for us to be on the same page together. And then when we did move, in 2010, it took us a little while to sell the house that we had that HELOC on. And so we were actually able to use that HELOC to put our down payment on the house in Indiana, which we wouldn't have been able to do. So we were able to buy a house because we had done this. And then when we finally sold the house in Ohio, it freed up money, like the all of the equity that we had built and all of that. I mean, it just gave us so many more options than we would have had if we'd followed the advice of that family member who was like, "Why are you doing this? It's silly."
Yeah, I love that the freedom that came from that.
Hmm.
And it's a little ironic that you used a HELOC for a down payment again, but then you paid it off, so it's okay. But I find that fun irony there. So you started out this way, really. So was there any of those expenses that you felt like you needed to rein in particular? I know that like, housing expenses, but I feel like you're kind of paying down housing expenses by removing the HELOC. So that's kind of
Hmm.
already reducing that. But did you make any cuts or any like sacrifices, quote unquote, in transportation or food or other areas of your life to make this work?
So we had to have some conversations about, and these are a lot of the kind of growing pain conversations that you have in early marriage, about how we spend our money. Um, so, like taking vacations, is that something that, do we plan to do that every year, or is that something that we save up for and do something really great once every 5 years? So like it kind of forced us to be intentional again. Um, and so, um, and there are some big differences in the way that my husband and I spend our fun money. He tends to not spend on day-to-day things, on little things. He won't spend $30 on like books or something like that, which is where I would spend money. Where, like every couple of weeks I'll spend that. But he will spend a big chunk of money on something that he cares about, like he's very into video games, so a console, or he's into cars, so something like that. And so comparing those two ways of spending, where I think in the wash it comes out, so we probably spend about the same amount. It's just mine's in dribs and drabs, and his is in a big purchase once every 6 months or once a year. Um, and so we did have to have like some conversations, and sometimes they were conversations, the kind that you have through gritted teeth, um, about like, you're buying this, and because I don't understand the way that he spends his fun money, he didn't understand the way that I spend my fun money, and we had to kind of get on the same page and recognize like some of this is like we need to have discretionary funds that's just ours. Um, I know we had to kind of cut back on the dining out and convenience food type stuff, especially when I was teaching. His work was a 45-minute drive away. And so, yeah, he had a long commute. Um, and so by the time we got married, I'd been teaching for 2 years, so I wasn't quite the zombified, exhausted um, level I was my first year of teaching, but there were still some weeks where I was like not into cooking. you know and so that was something that we had to navigate sometimes, where like how are we going to handle the weeks where like he's had a long day, because it ended up being like a 10-hour day, but plus, a 42-minute commute on each end. And then I had a long day with a really tough situation with a kid. Neither of us feels like cooking. And, DoorDash thankfully wasn't a thing yet. We actually had to, get off our duffs and go pick up carry out. So it probably would have been a lot harder. Um, but those sorts of things I know we had to really think through and figure out at the time. Um, but that was again all part of trying to be intentional about our spending.
Yeah, you keep bringing up this word intentional. Um, what does intentionality? How do you live an intentional life? What are like the steps that you take to be intentional with your money? I feel like that's what's going to really help people clarify how they can make this, only living on one salary thing
Hmm.
work.
So What I think is important is, and this is so much easier said than done, but when you're like, take the time, if you can find a way when you're not having that low level buzz of like financial stress, of just sitting down and saying, like, what's important to me? Like, what is the most important thing to me in my life? What is it that I want to accomplish in my life? How do I want to spend my time? Who am I as a person? Who are we as a family? Who am I as an educator? And like really think through those things. I'm actually a big believer in journaling. I mean, this is where the writing comes in. Like just sitting down and like and jotting down notes of like who you are. Um, and having that sense of like who you are, how you want to spend your time, how you want to exist in the world, and what kind of energy you want to put in the world is a really good place to start. Because then once you've got that, then you can kind of go from there of when you are in the day-to-day life where it's so easy to just hit, click buy now, when it's so easy to just follow the the patterns that you've fallen into, the ruts that you've fallen into. Um, you can actually say, does this fit what I want, who I want to be, like the kind of educator, the kind of parent, the kind of spouse, the kind of, sibling, friend I want to be. And that to me is what I think is so beneficial about being intentional about your spending, because money at its core is energy. Like money doesn't actually exist in the real world. Like it exists because we have all decided that it exists. It doesn't have any value that we don't put on it. You can't eat money. You can't you can't make shelter out of money. You can't make clothing out of money. It doesn't exist. Um, and so when we treat it like it's this force of nature that does exist, we give it power that it doesn't need to have. So being intentional with your spending is reclaiming your power.
I love that. And I would contest that I think you can sew together dollar bills to make a dress if you really needed to.
It wouldn't
No, but
necessarily be very warm.
I definitely get that. It's not a real thing. And I try and tell, so I teach a personal finance class, and I'm very explicit with my students that money by itself is completely worthless, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
There is no value to the tangible, whatever, even gold has no
Hmm.
actual real value other than what we've just placed on it. We just decided that it's got a worth because it's
You,
shiny, right?
yes, you could theoretically live a full life off the grid without money. Like if you wanted to go out into the woods, you'd need food, you'd need shelter, you'd need clothing, you need all of those things. You don't need money. Um,
Yeah.
so you need money to exist in society because that's what we've decided as society together. And so kind of getting your mind around that, I feel like is very freeing, because then that kind of separates you from the hectic nature that money can put on our lives. Because then you can say like this is not necessary. This is just part of how it's the grease of the wheels for society. And so I don't need to place all of my worries on it. I can put my intention on what I want for my life rather than on these little green pieces of paper.
Or little, dots on a screen because that's
Yeah,
what most
that's
computers
more
these
what
days
it
are.
is these days anyway. Yeah.
And I feel like if you would like to dive deeper into this kind of like, woo version of money that we're talking about here. I think the best book on this is Your Money or Your Life by Vicki
Oh
Robbins.
gosh, yes.
So,
I love
uh,
that book.
yeah, anyone listening, if you're like, yeah, I want to kind of understand this whole energy piece better, that's really what we're talking about. And you can find a link to that in the show notes at teachyourmoneyshow.com/podcast, or in the description of your podcast player. There'll be a direct link to the show notes there. And I just want to comment directly on what you're saying, like, the actual, money doesn't matter. Uh, but we have this whole podcast about money. So we obviously think it matters enough to have a podcast about it. And really for me, the thing that matters about it is because of the way we structured society. What
Hmm.
matters about money is we're getting that energy, time is another way of thinking about money. Um, and we're using that, storing it up in such a way that we can then purchase flexibility, purchase
Hmm.
freedom. You
Hmm.
talked about that freedom you had when you had made those correct money choices to then be able to move. Because I know a lot of people in 2010 that did not have the choice to move
Hmm.
because they could not sell their home for the value that they needed to sell it at. But you guys were able to make that. Obviously it's coming back up a little bit in 2010, so that's good. But like, if you had that full HELOC on there, you mean you could have sold the rest of the house, but you would still have had the HELOC to pay off
Hmm. Hmm.
in some form. So that that's where money really matters, is because
Hmm.
within a society you can use that to gain freedom. And that's what we're
Yes.
talking.
Yeah. One of the things that I like to tell people is a lot of people think of money as stressful and of like planning ahead for money as stressful. They're like, oh, I don't want to think about it because it's going to stress me out. And okay, that's fair. I think I understand that's reasonable, that's fair. But what I want to remind people is that you might be avoiding the momentary stress of like looking ahead when your bills are due and like thinking through what your budget is and those sorts of like little stressors, but you're trading that for the bigger stressors of when there's a fire, that you have to put out because there's a bill that you forgot about. And so you have these little mini emergencies that you have to deal with because you weren't thinking about it ahead of time. And so it's a matter of knowing where your energy's going. And for me, thinking ahead about money and like making those choices that we did during those first 2 years of our marriage was about, oh, I'm making us like what feels like a small sacrifice now for big freedom later, and flexibility later. And that for whatever reason, the way my brain is structured, it was easy for me to see that. And I know for a lot of people, for whatever reason, they find money stressful, and it's harder for them to see that their trade-off is that they're going to have a like minor or major financial catastrophe down the line. And then that's self-perpetuating. Like once you've had that, you then are like you're afraid to touch the stove because money seems like it's always stressful because every time you deal with it, it's stressful because you haven't had the opportunity to plan ahead and have it be like, oh, this is a breeze because you haven't done that. And so that's something that I really want to encourage people to think about is like um, the energy that you put into it, you can put a little energy into it and have it take care of you in the future. And it's like an exponential difference um, instead of ignoring it and then having to like expend a huge amount of energy later.
Yeah, and just to highlight really what you're saying about the low stress now versus the big stress later. You know, I'm working through my own personal finances, and I was recently able to take a vacation uh, that was completely budgeted for, like all of the crazy expenses that we were going to have, like dropping $40 on lunch or whatever, and it was so great. to not be like trying to nickel and dime it on the
Hmm.
vacation.
Hmm.
I, you know,
Hmm.
for all you people out there that are like me who go through like, like keeping track of everything that you've spent as you're trying to have a good time, it kind of wrecks the effect, right?
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and I'm going to talk more about this in another podcast I'm going to do just individually. But just the point I'm making is that by doing that low stress, like, okay, I'm putting money aside now, I'm putting money aside now, I'm making sure that I'm not overspending here. So that way I can put that into my budget. Went from other vacations I've been on where I get home like, oh man, we spent too much money. We got all these, to that was fun,
Hmm.
right? The
Hmm.
payoff was just a wonderful experience as a result. And I think that's really so important to remember that you you get that flexibility, that freedom, that release, that positive energy, however you want to describe it, in abundance
Hmm.
when you get this right. And if you ignore that, you're going to get the exact opposite. You'll have that low level of stress in the back of your mind the whole time, even though you're not like doing it actively, and then you're going to have the big stress. So it's
Hmm.
really no contest on going with the budget, do it intentionally, and then have the payoff at the end.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're gonna start wrapping up our conversation here. I just wanted to see like if where someone's trying to move towards this one income mindset, like you've got two incomes in the household, trying to move towards one income mindset here. This can be really difficult, especially for teachers who, we know are rather underpaid. So let's say we're in
Hmm.
a dual teacher income household and we're wanting to live on a single teacher income. And they're like, yeah, I'm not sure if that's even possible. What type of mindset shift would someone have to start working towards getting there where they can do this?
So I would start by, making sure you know what your outflow is. So like start with like what is it that you are paying for every month? So, there are the bills that don't change from month to month, like your mortgage or rent. If you have a car payment, daycare payments, those sorts of things. So start with those. If you're still paying student loans, sorry, if you're still paying student loans, those sorts of things. Um, you want to like start with those and then start kind of keeping track of like how much you're spending on groceries from month to month, dining out, gifts, those sorts of things that, if you've got school age kids, there's always, like the uniforms for for soccer or, the field trips, those sorts of things. Um, and it starts with just kind of keeping an eye on what those are. And one thing that you can do is say, okay, how about we start with the fixed expenses will come out of this person's salary and the variable expenses will come out of this person's salary. And that's just a way to start. Um, because that can be really helpful in if you are just thinking, we're saying, this teacher is covering the fixed expenses, this teacher's covering the variable expenses, and, at the end of 3 months, see like where you are and say like, oh, okay, well, the person covering fixed expenses had this much left over at the end of each month. Person covering variable expenses couldn't actually cover all the variable expenses. It was way more, and we were dipping into the fixed expenses person. But starting to look at things like that can start helping you see your money a little bit differently and start seeing your income and outflow in a way where you can start looking at it like Tetris, where you're like, okay, what pieces are coming in and how do they fit together? And then while it may not be possible to do what my husband and I did. And like I want to say we were really fortunate. He made a very good living. And I just the way that I think is not like everyone. And that's something that I was trying to show my sister how I set up my spreadsheet, and like I could just see her shut down. And I said to her, like, I do not expect everyone to do this. This is not like that just because I do this doesn't mean like, and you should too. Um, but whatever you can do to start thinking about, like, okay, if, one salary is covering, mortgage, student loans, daycare, and car payments, um, and that's all covered. And then the other one is covering variable expenses, and we can cover all of it with that. And then there's a little bit less, like, then we know what's left over. Then you can say, okay, well, let's start capturing whatever's left over. Maybe start with $100 every month. Then maybe move it up to $200 every month. Then maybe move it up. And so you can just start seeing how your money works for you instead of feeling like you're caged in by your money.
I love that splitting those two things, because if you can kind of like make it so they're separate, and you kind of force yourself to live within the variable expenses with that one salary, then you automatically have kind of that buffer on the
Hmm.
fixed expenses, because usually the fixed expenses aren't going to be as high as a whole salary. Usually, that might not always be the case. If it is, then that tells us probably something about what we need to do with our
Hmm.
fixed expenses. But if you do that, you're already building a gap. You're already widening that gap, and that's what we're all about: is widen that gap between your income and your expenses. And the wider it goes, the faster you're going to be able to pay off debt, save for retirement, or whatever else it is that your financial goals are. So I'm not sure who out there listening needs a award-winning financial writer, but if maybe they just have a question for you, or they actually need an award-winning financial writer, how can someone get in contact with you?
Well, you can find me at my website, emilyguyberken.com, or you can email me directly at emily@emilyguyberken.com.
All right. And once again, I will have that in the show notes at teachmoneyshow.com/podcast, or the direct link to the show notes in your podcast player in the description. So that way you can get in contact with Emily, because she's a great person. She responds to my emails, so she'll probably respond to yours too, right?
I absolutely will.
And my last question for you, Emily, is the same question I ask all my guests at the end, and it's simply this: what is your number one tip for teachers to have a richer wallet, classroom, and life?
Uh, Come into your classroom, come into your encounters with money, come into your life with a sense of curiosity, with a sense of openness, in the same way that you wouldn't want to greet your classroom, you wouldn't want to greet your kids with like, oh, you again. You don't want to greet your money with a, oh, you again. And you don't want to greet any aspect of your life with, ugh, you again. So, whatever life is throwing at you, whatever your money is throwing at you, and whatever your classroom is throwing at you, be open to it, be compassionate. Bring your educator cap and greet it with curiosity, openness, and a willingness to explore and ask questions.
I love that curiosity, openness. This just is such a beautiful thing, because it's this lifelong learner thing that we always talk about. It's this
Mhm.
just willingness to experience something new, and find the good in it. It's just that's such a we get a lot of, budget and things like that as a response, but I think this is a really fun new take on it, because it really applies to all aspects of classroom life and wallet. uh, Emily, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
I've had fun. Thank you for having me.
Wow, wasn't that a great episode? Thank you, Emily, for coming on the show. Now it's time for my clip notes, my top takeaways for this episode. Number one, incentive for the payoff. I love how they did the thermometer thing, kind of like, when we had those things as kids where they'd do the thermometer for the fundraiser and they're like, how much money can we get? And they'd like fill it up. But this way, it's the opposite. It's a debt payoff instead of how much money you can, raise. It's how much money you can pay off. I just think that that's really cool. And then they do small things to celebrate. If you're struggling to pay off debt, do those things and start celebrating along the way. At number two, money is like Tetris. Find how it fits. Make it fit. Don't just say, well, oh well. Say, okay, this is what I have. Where is it going to fit? This is the situation I'm in. How am I going to make this work? Put it so that way it lines up perfectly every single time. This is more of a mindset shift that you have to work with what you've got. Number three, freedom is what they bought with their debt pay down. They didn't have to pay down the debt, but they chose to pay down the debt, and it gave them the flexibility they needed to be able to move for a different job, a better job somewhere else. Number four, intentional. That was the word for this episode. And I love how she framed it as just asking what's important to me, what matters to my life, my classroom, my desire of who I want to be, and then ask, does this fit? If it doesn't fit, don't buy it. Such an important idea. Number five, create a little stress now so you can avoid big stress later. If you ignore your money, you're going to take away the little stress now or reduce it to get big stresses later. So you want to make sure that you are making those choices to do your budgeting, to track your spending, to rein things in, to have the proper documentations, insurances, and so forth. All those kind of boring things that are like a little stressful up front. So that way, when something bad happens, you are ready to handle it. Number six, track your spending. She didn't say this explicitly, but the idea was you want to know about your inflows. You want to know what's coming in, what's going out. You need to be aware of everything. And then you can start, putting it into those buckets she was talking about of like, okay, fixed here and variable there. But if you don't know what those numbers are, you can't start splitting them. So as I always say, the first step is track your spending. She said it too in another way. It's just an important thing to remember. And number seven, curiosity, openness, the desire to approach the world in such a way that you are ready for anything and you're going to meet it new for the first time instead of just getting bored with it or going, oh, not again. That is such a powerful mindset shift that's going to make our lives better. But of course, as a teacher, you are already rich. Your wallet just needs to catch up.
If you would like help on your personal financial situation, go to teachermoneyshow.com/coaching and you'll be able to find different ways I can help you there. If you would like to participate in spreading this message of financial empowerment to teachers, I would encourage you to talk to your administrator or to your district level about going to SeanKMorgan.com to find more information there. And regardless of which one of those you need, please like and subscribe so that way we can spread the reach of this more. Leave a 5-star rating and review. That's going to help more teachers find this. And then turn around and tell a teacher friend. I really appreciate it. The contents of this podcast are informational in nature and are not legal or tax advice. And neither I nor my guests are engaged in the provision of legal, tax, or any other advice. You should not act upon this information without first seeking appropriate advice from an accountant, financial planner, lawyer, or other professional.